The federal government shut down more than a week ago, and various agencies have been impacted, including the VA, the CDC, and even National Parks and Monuments and the passport services as well. Joining me to discuss the shutdown, some of the impacts to Minnesotans, we have Professor Kathryn Pearson from the University of Minnesota. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So, Dr. Pearson, let's begin. How is this impacting Minnesotans? In other words, who do you think is feeling the shutdown the most at this point?
Well, I think it depends what people are looking for from the federal government right now. Obviously, anyone trying to get a passport renewed or a new passport, anyone who has an application with the Small Business Administration or the Justice Department. So people with things in process are being held up. But the longer the shutdown goes on, the more of an impact we'll see. And that includes even some people who are working for the state government whose money may depend on federal contracts. And so the impact will really depend on the duration, but it doesn't seem as though it's going to end anytime soon.
Right. In fact, Congress does have until October 17th to pass a budget, or the U.S. will default on its financial obligations for the first time in history. What do you foresee at this point? How far-reaching, first of all, would those impacts be if America does, in fact, default?
They would be extraordinary. Economists, the Treasury Department, we're hearing all sorts of warnings. And I think the reason that there's some uncertainty is because, of course, the U.S. has never gone this route before. We came close in 2011 when Congress raised the debt limit at the 11th hour, but we've never actually faced a default. And it essentially would mean that the U.S. would be unable to pay its bills, unable to pay its obligations. And although I think the U.S. would try to prioritize, that would be very difficult when so many bills come due at once. But the debt limit increase and the continuing resolution that's being discussed in the House and Senate right now to keep the government open are actually two different issues. So Congress needs to act on both. But because of the timing, I think it's likely that these things will be considered in conjunction, not necessarily in the same bill, but at the same time as part of a strategy negotiated by both sides.
And let's talk about that strategy for a second. The president came on television on Tuesday saying he's willing to talk to the Republicans about these options. He's even open to discussing future revisions to the Affordable Care Act if Congress passes a working budget. Was that a good strategy on his part, in your opinion?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the president is essentially saying that he won't negotiate until after this crisis is passed, meaning that Congress has both raised the debt limit and passed a continuing resolution to reopen the parts of the federal government that are shut down. And in some ways, this could backfire if he's saying he's not going to negotiate until it's over. But the president is playing from a position of strength really for two reasons. One, he was reelected and public opinion is on his side. We are seeing a minority of Americans who are on the side of Republicans on this, but a majority of Americans, even those who do not like the Affordable Care Act, are saying that the government shouldn't be shut down over this issue, that they should be two separate things. The other issue going on right now is that Senate Democrats have passed a continuing resolution to keep the government funded, and House Republicans have only passed that continuing resolution with strings attached that would gut Obamacare in various ways. But what's going on right now is that there seems to be a majority of House members, virtually all the Democrats and about 20 or so Republicans, who would be willing, in fact, to vote to support the same continuing resolution to fund the federal government that the Senate has passed. But Republican House Speaker John Boehner won't bring it to the floor because in the House of Representatives, there's enormous agenda control. And so that dynamic, I think, also strengthens the president's hand. When any news program that talks about the shutdown says that there are at least 218 House members who would vote for it, that puts Speaker Boehner into a difficult position.
I'd like to touch on some words that you just spoke. You said at the 11th hour, passing of legislation in general. Do you think that in America and even in Minnesota, is this 11th hour style of negotiating, of passing laws, is it the new norm, and is it effective?
Unfortunately, I think it is the new norm. It has always been the case that more legislation is passed at the end of a session, whether it's in Congress or the Minnesota State Legislature, and that's not surprising. But this norm of not passing the budget bills on time is how we've gotten into this mess. So Congress is supposed to pass 12 annual appropriations bills that the president signs into law. Not one single one of those 12 bills has been signed into law. And so that's why we're not even talking about the regular appropriations process. We're talking about a continuing resolution that would fund the federal government at last year's levels. And I think it's important to remember that last year's levels are actually the levels that account for the sequester. So some of these federal employees who are furloughed right now because of the shutdown had already been furloughed about 1 day a week because of the sequester. But Americans are upset by this. No wonder Congress has historically low approval ratings. It's not a responsible way to govern. Congress knows that every year it's responsible for these 12 bills, but yet couldn't even pass one by the October 1st deadline.
And how do you think this is going to impact the Minnesota legislature?
Well, that's a good question. And I think it depends how long it goes on. If it goes on for an incredibly long time, the Minnesota legislature might be looking at some funding mechanisms to sort of fill the gaps that federal money is missing from. On the other hand, if the shutdown is resolved within the next couple of weeks or so, I think that's less likely. But certainly, between the Minnesota shutdown that lasted about 3 weeks and now this federal government shutdown, it's pretty clear that Americans are disgusted by this. And what is also clear is that these government shutdowns do not save money. They're actually quite costly to the government itself and to the economies that are affected.
You just said Americans are disgusted by this for the most part. Do you think they're also surprised that many of them are impacted when perhaps they thought they wouldn't be?
I think some may be. I mean, I think different people have different levels of awareness about how much the federal government affects them. And so I think just as we saw with the Minnesota state government shutdown, we saw a lot of people who were affected in ways that really surprised them. And well beyond state employees, but people who wanted to go to parks or perhaps worked at the racetracks, you know, any number of people who didn't expect a shutdown to affect their daily lives. And we're beginning to see that here with this federal shutdown. The impact will be felt more deeply over time.
My last question for you. In the case of the state shutdown, the governor essentially blinked. He stopped, he waved the white flag and asked Minnesota voters to decide the following year on whether or not he made the right move or the wrong move. How do you think this is going to play out nationally next year at the polls?
Well, the 2014 midterm elections essentially won't change the dynamics in Washington that much. Only 15% of seats in the House of Representatives are even remotely competitive. And that's part of what's going on with the dynamic that we see right now. So many of the Republicans who refuse to vote for a continuing resolution unless it somehow undercuts Obamacare are from very safe districts. And so I think it's unlikely that party control will switch in the House of Representatives, even though the shutdown is hurting the Republican Party reputation more than the Democratic Party reputation. And in fact, Republicans going into the Senate midterm elections in 2014 are actually in a position of strength. And so I actually don't think it'll have a huge electoral impact in 2014 because of the nature of the races.
Okay, with those words, Dr. Kathryn Pearson, thanks for joining us. We appreciate your time as always.
My pleasure. Thank you.